Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak with what I hope is going to be the next Cape Falcon Kayak design. Now what this is a whitewater capable river touring kayak. It's something that you might use on a long self-support trip where you've got a lot of flat water and swift water, a little bit of class 1 and class 2, and the occasional class 3 or even class 4 rapid that you've got to get through depending on the character of that rapid and also whether you have the skills to paddle that kind of water. Now, other than the early slalom kayaks of the late 1970s or the early whitewater kayaks of the early 1980s, or some of the more recently released hybrid kayaks, there really hasn't been much in the paddling world for this particular use. And what that's meant for me as a paddler is that I've been going on these types of river trips in either overloaded whitewater kayaks from the early 1990s or shorter sea kayaks of my own design. And the problem with doing it in even an older, longer whitewater kayak is that when you load it down with gear, it paddles even worse in the flat water sections, and it still doesn't do very well in the whitewater either. But if you do it in a sea kayak, yeah, it does great in the flat water, but once you get into the swift water in class 1, the eddies and the currents are constantly grabbing the ends and pulling you offline, and you end up expending a ton of energy, which just doesn't lead to a very enjoyable paddling experience. And then, of course, running sea kayaks through class 3 rapids is annoying and frustrating and sometimes dangerous depending on the situation. So I've always wanted a kayak for this specific use, and about 10 years ago I started making prototypes to see if I could design one. Now the first 3 or 4 prototypes completely sucked, and sometime around prototype number 6 I designed a boat that was really pretty darn good. It did good in the whitewater, it toured well with a load even in whitewater conditions, but it was reasonably swift in the flat water as well. And overall I liked it. I built another one which I liked a little bit more, but I just didn't feel like I could punch through that design ceiling from pretty good into really good. And personally, I'm not going to paddle something that's pretty good, and I'm definitely not going to release a design or a plan set for something that's pretty good. So the whole project just kind of stalled out for a couple years while I was waiting to get some new design inspiration, and that came last year in the form of a commission I got to reproduce 2 native North Alaskan kayaks. Now, if you follow me here at Cape Falcon Kayak, you know that I really do 2 different things. One is designing modern kayaks out of skin-on-frame and just using the skin-on-frame technology as a really rapid prototyping means to create boats that paddle the way that I want them to paddle. And the other one is replicating traditional Arctic kayaks. Now, I like traditional Arctic kayaks just because I'm interested in the history, but I also like them because so many of them are so strange and unusual that oftentimes they will give me design inspirations that then I can apply to my modern kayaks, and it can really help me break through some of those creativity blocks, which is exactly what happened with the North Alaskan kayaks. Now, the North Alaskan kayaks were originally intended for architectural display, so I didn't get to spend much time with them. But before I sent the frames away, I wrapped them in saran wrap and took them down onto the water. And really, they felt very strange. Not something I would ever really want as one of my own personal kayaks. But that's not surprising because native Arctic kayaks were designed for hunting, not for modern paddling performance. And if there were any parts of the design that made it a little bit easier to reach the hunting objective, that made the general paddling a little bit worse, those were the things that got selected for. So I never judge an Arctic kayak by how it feels just to me for my own paddling uses. What I like to do is just get into it with an open mind and just have the experience and see what I can learn from it. And what I learned from the North Alaskan kayaks was that that particular hull shape has tremendous promise for quickness, speed, and maneuverability. Now, quickness and speed are actually very different things, and it's a complicated topic that I'm not going to go into right now, but I will say that it's very hard to design a kayak that is both quick and fast. And the North Alaskan kayaks just seem to strike this perfect balance between both of those, and also they're extremely maneuverable because of how the hull is shaped. Now, for those particular kayaks, the maneuverability actually wasn't enjoyable for me because if you stopped focusing on what you were doing for a half a second, they would spin in a circle, which is not that much different than, say, a racing kayak without a rudder on it, or an old slalom kayak or an old whitewater kayak. But it did give me the idea that maybe I could use that same shape and be able to retain that quickness and that speed and apply it to a different overall hull balance and create something that might suit my needs for this river kayak idea I've been working on for so long now. So I came up with this crazy plan to just try something weird, which is to take the deck from my F1 kayak and stick a North Alaskan hull on the bottom of it. So even though this was kind of a shot in the dark, and I went into this kind of expecting that it probably wasn't going to work out, I felt like it was at least an experiment worth running because the F1 deck is already kind of the right size and shape for this kind of a boat. I've got the cargo areas perfectly worked out in the ends, and also the cockpit comfort is as good as it possibly can be, which is super important because if you're not comfortable in your kayak for hours and hours on end, you're not going to have a good river touring experience, and you're also just not going to be able to control your boat very well. Also, I've already got the videos and the plans created for at least the deck portion of the F1 kayak, which means that if this overall concept worked out, that would free me up to really focus on the hull design, which in and of itself is a lot of work. So went ahead and gave it a shot, made myself an F1 deck and a North Alaskan hull. I put them together, I took it down to the water, and it turns out that I just love paddling this kayak. Believe it or not, at 13.5 feet, this boat is as fast as my sea kayaks, but it actually even feels a little bit quicker, it accelerates a little bit quicker, and I can spin it 180 degrees in a single sweep stroke. So that's not to say that this is necessarily the next great do-everything boat, because anytime you're talking about boat design and you're looking to make big gains in performance, you're usually going to be losing something in other areas. And even though this boat is as maneuverable as a whitewater kayak and as fast as a sea kayak, it doesn't necessarily have the same sea kayak performance. So for instance, my F1 kayak is absolutely excellent in the wind and the waves and the surf. It's also something that you can control very easily, even with body leans, which is super useful in narrow passageways where you might not have room to take the same kind of wide strokes you would need to take in this to kind of keep it on line. And so it's not necessarily better, it's just a very different boat concept than the sea kayaks that I've designed. Although it is interesting because even though this was originally conceived as a moving water river kayak only, I've been having a lot of fun lately taking it out on lots of different kinds of water and just getting to know it, which kind of reminds me of my first experiences with the F1, which was originally designed as a surf-specific boat, but ended up having a lot more versatility than that. So there's really no way to know at this point how much versatility this particular design concept is going to have. For right now, I'm just really stoked that I finally got a prototype that works good. So what I was about to do here, and what I actually did do here, was I spent some time talking about the difference between the similarly sized but very differently shaped older whitewater boats of the past and this hull design that I'm working on right here. I went into a ton of detail about the performance, the advantages, the disadvantages, and my experiences paddling it on the water. So the problem was that when I was finished, I realized it was going to make this video way too long. So if you're interested in those subjects, I've gone ahead and broken that out into a separate video that you can check out. For now, why don't we just go to the front of the boat here and we're going to go on a tour. So coming to the bow here, my big goal was to keep as much volume forward in the kayak for as long as possible, to keep this from submarining and also to reduce the pin potential as well. Now, how I dealt with this in earlier prototypes was I spread the gunnels apart with a headboard and then I brought the stringers up to meet on the bottom of that, and kind of roughly volumetrically that did work, but the shape that the water flowed over just wasn't that clean, and you would get a gurgle down here, which was annoying to listen to, but also I felt like it was introducing turbulence along the hull. And really what you're hoping for in boat design is to get good clean laminar flow for at least the first foot or so before it starts disintegrating into turbulent flow, because that's a quick way to pick up just a tiny little bit of extra quickness in your boat. Now, if I hadn't seen it in person, I would have never thought to do things the way that the North Alaskans did here, which is just to terminate the stringers at the last rib, which is very close to the bow, and then just to bring the keel up to the underside right here. Now, the way the North Alaskans did it is even better than what I did right here. They actually made a very wide piece that was carved and shaped that would be stronger and would be even a better shape in this area. But it takes literally all day to make one of those. So what I did is I just did a straight keel here, and then I reinforced it a little bit for strength. Now, I also brought some secondary stringers on the outside of the gunnels and then up to the top of the gunnels right here. And this just kind of gives it kind of a general V shape right here, which also helps it to kind of ride upwards when it's hitting, you know, waves or other water. And it does something that is pretty miraculous. It gives you a bow that's high enough volume that I feel like it's safe to run I guess you could say, safe to run the kind of whitewater that it's safe to run in, but it gives you cleaner flow than I would have ever imagined possible from this kind of a shape, resulting in a boat that is, at least at the outset here, ready to be pretty quick on the water. Now, if you look at this bow loop here, all of my kayak designs, I run a continuous leather loop through the gunnels, across, and I tie it together at the top here. And this is not something I do for traditional effect. This is something I do because I like how this stands up by itself, which means that I can put a paddle underneath or take it out. And that's really great because even in a river tour like this, I would probably be using a Greenland paddle a lot of the time. And in whitewater, that would be my spare paddle. And it's always nice to be able to grab a fully assembled paddle off the front deck so you can roll up if for some reason your main paddle got ripped out of your hands. I also always feel like you should be able to lift, tow, or rescue by any line that is on any kayak. Okay, so coming back along the deck here, you can see I've got a center ridge the same way as I have in my sea kayaks. Now, this doesn't really have a functional reason. I mean, I guess you could make up some BS about it shedding water or something like that. But the reason that I do this is because it's the least amount of wood that I can add and still have some kind of support for the fabric in this area. Now, it actually does make a decent mounting surface for cleats or camera mounts or something like that, so I guess it can have some function. So, thinking about the deck line arrangement in here, you can see that I don't have my typical sea kayak deck line arrangement. What I did was I borrowed an idea from my pack canoes, where I use a loop of bungee that is tied between two pad eyes. Now, the reason I did this is that with the leather lines that I use on my sea kayaks, where it penetrates the skin here, sometimes we can get leaks. Now, I deal with this by just putting a little bit of sealant underneath there, and as long as you do that every year or two, the leaks are pretty minimal. But for this particular boat, I wanted to make it as dry as possible, and so I just thought I would explore how these little bungee and pad eyes worked in this type of a situation. Now, my initial impression is not great here. I do like how securely they hold a Greenland paddle. So in the bow here, I'm still going under the leather, and in the back, I'm coming underneath the bungee, and it just really locks this thing down in place. But what I don't like about it is that these aren't wide enough to put my wider whitewater paddle under, and most of the time, unless I'm in whitewater, I really would rather be paddling with a Greenland paddle. But the other problem is that they don't let me do something that I've gotten so used to, which is being able to put a Greenland paddle underneath a pair of leather deck lines to act as a stabilizer. Once you've made that part of your normal kayaking routine, not being able to do that is incredibly frustrating because this just lets you pop your spray skirt, eat lunch, go pee, do whatever you want to do with a paddle that you can grab at any time and use. So, not super stoked about this right now. I'll probably try another variation of this on the next prototype before I just give up and go back to the leather deck line arrangement. So that's the front deck here. Now let's check out the cockpit. So I put this down on the floor here so you can see what's going on a little bit better. And what this is just kind of my standard modern skin-on frame cockpit arrangement. And this is something I've put a lot of work into over the years because even though Arctic kayaks are often very intriguing and very beautiful, comfort is not always their strong suit. So what I've done here is just mimicked the kind of outfitting that you see in a really well-made modern kayak. So we've got a coaming here that strikes a good balance between having good knee purchase on either side here, but still gives you enough room that you can use the center of your cockpit as kind of a gear staging or a food staging area, and also can potentially raise your legs up a little bit so you can adjust your comfort while you're paddling. Now, in the back of this here, I've got a Snapdragon back band, which is tied in place so it sits in an optimal location to support your lower back and also your sacrum while you're paddling, but it can also be pulled up and it stops right here where you can get to your gear bags and you can load things in and out of the back of the kayak. Now, on the bottom of the kayak, the entire floor here is covered with a Thermarest ridge rest mat. And out of all the different seating arrangements, some of them quite expensive that I've tried over the years, I always end up going back to the ridge rest because it's really comfortable. The little ridges tend to catch any grit that gets into your kayak, and it lets your sit bones sink down a little bit in the boat, which allows me to build boats with a slightly narrower waterline that still feel as stable as boats that are a little bit wider, which means that I can get a little bit more speed out of a boat and still have it be stable. Now, the other advantage of having my sit bones sitting a little lower there is it gives me relatively more room to raise my knees higher so I can have a more comfortable cockpit without having to increase the overall volume of the boat in this area. So I'm just going to go ahead and hop in here for a second so you can see how this all comes together. One of the main reasons I tie this back band in place is because one of the most frustrating things in kayaking is when you get in your kayak and the back band goes under your butt, which is especially annoying in a rocky surf launch. So sitting down in here nice and snug, my knees kind of hold in this area. Now the knee comfort in one of these boats is great because you're flexing the skin a little bit in this area. Now over time you'll start to get some cracking in this area, but it doesn't actually damage the boat and it still stays nice and waterproof. My knees are held in place by these little knee braces right here, and my feet are sitting on some Wilderness Systems slide lock foot braces, which I really like because they're very easy to adjust from the cockpit without having to get in and out of your boat. So as you're touring all day and you start to get uncomfortable, you can change your foot position. And the other reason that I like this cockpit to be kind of exactly like this is because even though I can brace my knees when I need to in whitewater, I can also raise my legs for the long touring sections, and I can relax a little bit, I can massage my thighs, and this is actually a much more optimal ergonomic position for flat water paddling, which is why all the racing kayaks and all the surf skis have you sitting like this. It's not perfect, you're a little bit squeezed together here, but I do feel like this is a good compromise. And if you wanted a more aggressive cockpit, you could certainly build one and you could put more thigh hooks in here. So anyways, that's my standard cockpit arrangement. Now let's head to the back deck. Now coming to the back deck here, you can see that the area behind the cockpit is almost completely flat. Now I show two different ways to do this in my plans and my videos, because if you arch the back deck slightly, it makes for much nicer access to your cargo space in the back here. But if you make the back deck completely flat, it makes it easier to get in and out, it makes your rescues a little bit easier, and also it allows you to carry a deck load in this area. So I feel like people can weigh the pros and the cons of both of those and make whatever decision makes sense for their kayak. Now you can see back here I've also borrowed that same pad eye and bungee loop system that I created for my skin-on frame canoes, and mostly I did this just because I didn't want leather deck lines penetrating right here and having potential leak points, and also because even though I think it's unlikely that you would ever do a paddle float outrigger style rescue in a river touring kayak like this, I wanted something that at least potentially could receive a larger style modern paddle like this, which my narrower leather deck lines don't really do very well. Now, once again, there are definite downsides to this. The big one is that it doesn't satisfy my requirements for being able to lift, carry, rescue, or tow by any line on a kayak. But it does give me some really convenient attachment points, because even though we always tell ourselves that we're never going to strap anything on the back deck, in real life, oftentimes a tent or some other object ends up back here. So I feel like rather than just pretending like it's not going to happen, why don't we plan for it and make sure there's at least some solid attachment points for that so we can strap it down securely in rough water. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to be the ultimate solution here or not. It's just kind of what I'm working with right now. So coming to the back of the kayak here, I've got another one of these really strong leather loops that you can tow, rescue, or carry the kayak by. And behind that, I've got something a lot of people have been asking me about, which is this little drain plug back here. Now, this isn't the first drain plug I've put in a skin-on frame kayak, but I usually don't put it in my sea kayaks just for my own personal preferences. In this whitewater kayak, it does make a lot of sense though to be able to drain out the water that inevitably accumulates in any whitewater kayak. Now, I'm probably not going to put up a free video for how to install this, but I'm definitely going to be including these instructions in my paid kayak courses. So if you're interested in installing one of these, I should have videos up for this within a couple weeks from the date that this video is published here. So that's the end of the kayak. Now let's just talk about where we're going to be heading next with this design. So I want to talk about kind of where I see this design going and some of the modifications that I'm hoping to make with the next series of prototypes. But before I do that, I just want to answer one of the most common questions that I get, not just about this boat, but in skin-on frame in general. And that is, how durable is skin-on frame, and is it going to be strong enough for a whitewater situation? Now, unfortunately, this is the one question that I can't answer because it depends on how heavily you build the boat and the situation that you're going to be using it in. If you build the boat with a very lightweight frame and a very lightweight skin and a very light coating on it, it's not going to be very durable at all. Now, that might be okay if you're using it in a situation that's really flat water and you're using it very carefully, in which case you get the advantage of having a boat that's super lightweight. But on the other hand, if you build a boat really heavily, then you can take it in really rough conditions and just beat the heck out of it, and it's going to survive just fine, but you're not going to have that magic lightweight feel. So what I try to do as a designer is just do a ton of experimentation and testing, and most importantly, destructive testing, which is building these lighter than I think they need to be and pushing them to the point of failure. Because what I find is that a lot of times these lightweight frameworks will remain intact through stuff that you would be certain was going to break them, but there'll be just key points that are more likely to fail in the skin and in the framework, and those points can be reinforced or accommodated for, and you can keep the boat as light as possible while still getting the durability to match the intended uses. So that's kind of my non-answer to the durability question. I'm going to try to do a separate video on this topic where I really get into framing details and skin choices and coating choices and how all that impacts longevity. Now, just to give you a little bit of specifics, this particular boat right here is built with my standard sea kayak layup, which is a white oak ribs, red cedar stringers, red cedar gunnels, an 8-ounce skin, and 5 coats of 2-part polyurethane on the bottom, 3 coats of 2-part polyurethane on the top. And I would envision this boat being just fine for some of the early spring wilderness trips where I've just got a lot of swift water, a lot of flat water, doing a little bit of class 1 and class 2, and maybe I have 1 class 3 thrown in there. So I might be hitting some rocks, but I'm not going to be just bashing it down a rocky riverbed or dragging it over rocks all the time. And this gets me a boat that would be durable for maybe 1 or 2 trips like that a year, but also is lightweight enough that I still can just enjoy it as my day boat. It's 31 pounds. I can take it off the car, throw it in the water, and have a good time in the evenings without having to switch to a separate boat. So that's what I want to do with my boat. What you might want to do with your boat could be completely different. You might want to build this thing much heavier so you could use it in much rougher circumstances, or maybe you don't care about hitting rocks or running it down whitewater, and you're just looking for a swift water capable boat, something that's fast and nimble, but is kind of very different than the normal flavor of a modern sea kayak. In which case, you could build this thing a little bit narrower, you could build it a lot lighter, and you would just have a beautiful little boat. So that's the cool thing about skin on frame, is that you can really make it whatever you want it to be within the shaping constraints that this kind of a technology will allow. And really both the art and the difficulty of that, at least for me as a designer, is exploring all of those different places. So I can give people predictable recommendations for what sorts of shapes and what sorts of layups are going to lead to what sorts of performance and what sorts of durability. So I think where I'm going with this guy next is I'm going to build myself another prototype. I'm going to make it a 1/2 inch wider. I'm going to fill out the shape a little bit right here on the hull. I'm probably going to add a little bit stronger stringers on the bottom of the boat here. I'm going to leave the skin and the coating pretty much the same. And I'll probably build this over the next couple weeks. So if you're on Instagram, you could follow that build, because I post updates every day and I'm always sharing different tips and sometimes kayaking information that I don't share anywhere but in my paid courses. So check that out. It's always kind of a cool thing to watch. After I'm done with that, what I'm going to do is I'll take the new prototype and I'll take this prototype and I'll take them on a wilderness trip with a friend, and we'll really put them through their paces. And if, and this is a big if, after that experience, I still believe in this design, then I'm going to think about releasing a beta plan. And this is a little bit different than what I've done in the past, because how I used to design these kayaks is I would get to this point and I would spend the next 2 or 3 years just refining the design and then figuring out the sizing for all different sizes of users. But that is incredibly time consuming. And by putting out a beta course that is kind of an early release version, I can get people building these, and that kind of helps me to evolve the design and also lets people that are a little more adventurous get into the designs in the early phases. So that's where things are at right now, and that's where we're going to be heading. I really hope this design holds up, because I just love paddling this little kayak, and I think it would be a great addition to the Cape Falcon lineup. Now, I know this was kind of a long video, so if this is a little too tedious for you, make sure you let me know in the comments. I can always scale things back, but I like to include as much information as I possibly can. So if you like this video, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. You can also check us out at our website, which is capefalconkayaks.com, where I've got a bunch more skin-on-frame building videos and various skin-on-frame resources. You can find me on Instagram at CapeFalconBuilds, where I post a daily build blog of everything I'm doing in the shop here, including time-lapse videos. Thanks for watching, be safe while you're paddling, and have fun building your skin boat.